The river Aldenmere did not forgive carelessness. Every child born within 10 miles of its banks was taught this before they were taught their prayers, its current deceptively smooth at the surface, merciless beneath, the kind of water that accepted whatever fell into it and surrendered nothing willingly. Miss Mabel Dashwood had been crossing the old stone bridge when she saw it. Not a splash, the river swallowed sound as greedily as it swallowed everything else, but a flash of blue wool tumbling beneath the surface with terrible speed. She did not deliberate. She did not call for help. She simply climbed the wall and jumped. She had the boy on the bank, the water out of him, and his breathing restored to something resembling order when the thunder of hooves crested the ridge above and stopped. Stand away from him. Controlled. The voice of a man so accustomed to obedience that the command required no force to carry absolute authority. Miss Dashwood pressed once more on the boy's back, satisfied herself that his color was returning, and only then looked over her shoulder. The Duke of Northcliffe sat astride a black horse as composed and forbidding as its master, dark-coated, straight-backed, with a face educated so thoroughly out of expression that what remained was something close to severity. He was already looking at his son. He had not yet looked at her. He descended the embankment, crouched beside the boy, and placed one gloved hand briefly to the child's cheek. Something passed across his face, swift, unguarded, gone before it could be named. Then he turned. He regarded her the way one regards something unexpected in a familiar room. Then his hand moved to his coat, and a leather purse landed in the grass between them with the soft, heavy sound of considerable money. "You have our gratitude," said the Duke of Northcliffe. "It is sufficient." Miss Dashwood looked at the purse. She looked at the boy, young Cassian Sterling, though she did not yet know his name, who had turned his face toward her and was gripping her ruined sleeve with both hands. She looked at the Duke. She stood, wrung the river water from her braid with 2 brisk twists, and said quite pleasantly, "I thank your Grace for the gesture," and walked away. The purse remained in the grass. Behind her, not a soul spoke. The guards did not move. Arthur Sterling, Duke of Northcliffe, who had in 31 years never once watched someone decline his money and leave, said nothing at all. He simply watched her go, until Cassian tugged his coat and said, in the small certain voice of a child not yet acquainted with being wrong about people, "Papa, who is she?" Hey guys, I need your help in getting this channel to 2,000 subscribers. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting updates. Now let's continue the story. Chapter 1. She didn't even curtsy. The cold had entered her bones before she reached the bank, but Miss Dashwood had ceased to notice it somewhere between the bridge and the boy. The river had not released him willingly, it never did, and the current had fought her with the particular viciousness of water that has grown accustomed to winning. She had won regardless. She always did in the ways that mattered. He was perhaps 5 years of age, slight and dark-haired, with a fine wool coat and polished boots of a child whose world had never yet acquainted him with want. That world had not, however, acquainted him with river safety, and she had thoughts on the subject that she fully intended to share with whoever was responsible for him. She settled him against her side, wrapped her own coat firmly around his trembling shoulders, her own trembling being a matter she declined to acknowledge, and began the efficient work of clearing his lungs, speaking to him in a low, steady voice as she did so. "There we are. That is quite enough of that. Breathe if you please." "Very good. You are perfectly safe now, though I confess the river has made rather a ruin of us both." She was mid-instruction, and we shall discuss the particular foolishness of standing on wet stone near moving water, once you are warm enough to receive a lecture properly, when the shadow fell. It arrived the way he arrived, she would later reflect, without announcement, without warmth, with the absolute expectation of immediate attention. The shadow of a man on horseback is a particular kind of shadow, long, angular, carrying with it the suggestion of height and consequence, and this one fell directly across the boy and across her, as though even the light bent itself to accommodate the Duke of Northcliffe. Miss Dashwood did not look up. She had noted the thunder of hooves, the abrupt halt, the quality of the silence that followed, the held-breath silence of men awaiting a signal from their master. She had assessed, in the efficient manner of a woman who had spent considerable time navigating the households of the powerful, that whoever sat above her was accustomed to immediate deference. She had then returned her attention to the boy, whose color was improving and whose grip on her sleeve had not loosened in the slightest. The Duke of Northcliffe, she would learn, had not been ignored in 31 years. Not by servants, not by peers, not by foreign dignitaries nor members of Parliament nor the occasional archbishop who had cause to seek his favor. He was not ignored by horses. He was not, as far as any present could recall, ignored by the weather. He was ignored now by a woman in a soaked muslin dress who was explaining river currents to his son in the same tone one might use to discuss the proper storage of preserves. She heard him descend. She heard the measured footfall of a man who moved as though the ground were a courtesy extended to him rather than a surface he occupied in common with other mortals. She heard him crouch. And she heard, though she did not look, the almost imperceptible change in his breathing when he saw that the boy was alive and conscious and clinging, with great determination, to the sleeve of a woman he had never met. When she did look up, she found him already looking at her. Not at the boy. Not at the river. At her. It lasted only a moment, that look, before his expression reassembled itself into something appropriately ducal. But she had seen it. A crack, barely wider than a hairline, in the stone. She filed it away with the same quiet efficiency with which she filed everything, and said nothing. He said, "You have our gratitude. It is sufficient." The purse landed between them. She looked at it. She looked at the boy, who had turned his face into her shoulder with the instinctive trust of a child who has decided, without deliberation, that a person is safe. She looked at the Duke. She stood, wrung out her braid, said, with perfect pleasantness, that she thanked his grace for the gesture. And she walked away. The purse remained in the grass. Behind her, she heard nothing. Not a word, not a footstep, not the sound of a man who had received what he expected. She heard, instead, the particular silence of someone watching. She did not look back. She had reached the first turn in the path before the guard's hand closed around her arm. He was large, as ducal guards tended to be, and wore the expression of a man who had been told, on numerous occasions, that his size was itself a form of argument. He had, in Miss Dashwood's estimation, been misinformed. "You will remain," he said, "until his grace has finished with you." "I was not aware," said Miss Dashwood, without raising her voice, "that his grace had begun." The guard's expression shifted toward something less certain. He did not release her arm. It was at this precise moment that the boy, who had been silent since she left him, silent in the bewildered way of a child trying to understand a world that had just tilted, drew breath and screamed. Not in fear. In fury. In the absolute, uncomplicated outrage of a small person who has decided that a wrong is being committed and intends to say so at considerable volume. He screamed her name, not her name precisely, for he did not know it, but the word came out as her, pointed and insistent, and he had already scrambled upright and was crossing the grass at a speed that suggested his lungs, at least, had fully recovered from the river. He seized her free hand in both of his and planted himself beside her with the posture of a child who has declared, without room for negotiation, that he is not moving. The Duke had not spoken. He stood 3 paces back, watching, with an expression that gave nothing away, and yet, she was good at reading what expressions attempted to conceal, was giving away rather more than he intended. His jaw had tightened when the guard touched her. His gaze had moved to his son with something swift and complex when the boy screamed. And now, looking at the child's grip on her hand, he was looking at a thing he could not purchase, could not command, and could not entirely account for. He raised one hand. The guard released her immediately and stepped back. "Leave us," said the Duke. The guards withdrew to a distance that preserved the appearance of privacy without sacrificing proximity. The boy did not release her hand. The Duke looked at her with the focused attention of a man accustomed to reading a room in its entirety and then deciding, in a matter of seconds, what it was worth to him. She met his gaze. This, she understood, was the test. A commoner held a peer's gaze for as long as it took to receive instruction and no longer. It was not a rule written anywhere, but it was a rule observed everywhere, In every drawing room and servants' hall and corridor she had navigated in the past 10 years. She had never found the rule particularly compelling. She held his gaze for one beat longer than propriety prescribed. Then she looked down at the boy, said quite gently, "You ought to return to your father now. He has been frightened on your behalf, even if he would rather you did not know it," and turned and walked away along the path. She heard him say nothing. She told herself, on the walk back to the village, that the warmth at the back of her neck was the wind. She was not, in general, a woman given to self-deception, but she found on this particular afternoon that she was willing to make an exception. The summons arrived the following morning, delivered by a footman in Northcliffe livery whose manner suggested he was unaccustomed to delivering summons to addresses quite so modest. Miss Dashwood read the letter twice, noted that it was signed with a title and no Christian name, observed that the word request appeared nowhere in its contents, and arrived at Northcliffe Park 40 minutes later than the specified hour. The estate was everything that wealth and old consequence could produce and nothing that warmth could add to it. It was magnificent in the manner of a thing that has been maintained rather than loved. The grounds immaculate, the stonework recently pointed, the entrance hall furnished with the exacting correctness of a man who had employed the finest decorators and then removed everything they suggested that might imply a personal preference. It was, she thought, a very beautiful house that had been successfully prevented from becoming a home. She was shown to the study. He was standing at the window when she entered, which she suspected was deliberate. The light behind him, the desk between them, the room arranged to remind a visitor of the precise dimensions of the distance between their respective positions. He turned as she entered, assessed her unpunctuality with a look that communicated its displeasure without requiring him to give voice to it, and gestured toward the chair across the desk. She sat. She did not apologize for her lateness. He remained standing, which she suspected was also deliberate. "I have a position to offer," he said, without preamble. "My son's current caretaker has proved unsuitable. The post requires a woman of steadiness, discretion, and some capability in managing a child of lively disposition." A pause, precisely measured. "You have demonstrated, at the very least, the last of these qualities." "That is generous of your grace," said Miss Dashwood. "What are the terms?" He named them. They were generous, more than generous, carefully calibrated to the sum a woman of her apparent station could not reasonably decline. He watched her face as he named them, she noted, with the attention of a man accustomed to watching offers land. "And if I were to decline?" she asked. The room went still in a manner that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. The secretary near the window stopped his writing. The steward by the door became very interested in the middle distance. Even the fire, she fancied, paused. The Duke looked at her. He was, she thought, genuinely uncertain how to answer. Not because the question was unanswerable. He could have said then you will decline with the indifference of a man who had alternatives ready, but because the question had been asked at all. In this room, in this house, in every house like it, the question was not asked. One was offered. One accepted. The architecture of the thing did not accommodate a door marked refusal. She waited with the patience of a woman who has learned that silence, deployed correctly, is the most efficient tool available to those without power. He said at last, "Then you will decline." It was not what he had intended to say. She could see that clearly. His jaw had shifted slightly, recalibrated, in the half-second before he spoke, and what had arrived was not the dismissal he had prepared but something oddly honest, an acknowledgment, dressed in indifference, that the choice was hers. He did not look pleased to have said it. She held his gaze and noted, in the careful ledger she kept of such things, that he was studying her face with rather more attention than the conversation strictly required. "I see," she said. "Then I shall hear the full terms before I decide." Something moved behind his eyes. He turned back to the window, and when he spoke again his voice had resumed its appropriate temperature. "My steward will provide them." The full terms were provided in a room that contained, in addition to herself and the steward, 3 members of the Duke's household council, men of late middle age and considerable self-importance, who regarded her with the collective expression of people watching a weather event they find both inconvenient and vaguely offensive. She listened. She then, with the pleasant directness of a woman who has nothing to prove and therefore nothing to perform, listed her own terms in return. She would have final authority over the boy's daily schedule, including outdoor hours, meals, and the arrangement of his rooms, which were currently, and she said this without particular apology, unsuitable for a child of his age and temperament. She would not be subject to instruction from household staff in matters pertaining to her charge. She would have one afternoon per week at her own disposal. She would be addressed as Miss Dashwood and not, as had been the custom with previous staff, by her Christian name alone. And she would, if she observed any matter she believed contrary to the boy's welfare, say so directly to the Duke, without first routing her concern through a steward. The council did not speak during this recitation. Their collective silence was of the variety that precedes an explosion, and she could see them all, in the corner of her eye, arranging themselves to deliver it. The Duke's jaw tightened. She watched him, as one watches a man deciding whether a thing has made him angry or merely surprised him, the two being, in men of his type, frequently indistinguishable. His eyes, however, had not gone to his steward or his counsel. They had remained on her, and they held something that she could not immediately name. Not admiration, it was too guarded for that. Not anger, it lacked the heat. It was the look of a man encountering a specimen he had not previously catalogued and was not yet certain where to place. The door, which had been left slightly ajar in the manner of rooms in which formal business is conducted, opened further. The boy came in. He had clearly evaded someone to do so. There was the particular brightness in his face that children acquire when they have successfully outmaneuvered an adult, and he crossed the room with the single-minded directness of a small person who has located the only thing in the room of interest to him. He did not look at the council. He did not look at the steward. He walked to Miss Dashwood, took her hand in both of his, and looked up at her with the serene confidence of a child who has already decided how things will be. The room was very quiet. Miss Dashwood looked down at him. She did not smile, not the broad, performed smile that adults produce for children in formal settings, but something quieter moved across her face. A softening, brief and genuine, that she neither manufactured nor concealed. She looked up. The Duke was watching his son. The expression on his face lasted only a moment, but it was unguarded in a way that none of his other expressions had been, a kind of naked recognition, as though the boy had answered a question the Duke had not known he was asking. Then his gaze moved to her, and the recognition shifted into something more complicated, more carefully managed, and not, she thought, entirely managed at all. "The terms," said the Duke of Northcliffe, "are acceptable." His counsel turned to look at him. He did not look at his counsel. The steward's pen scratched briefly and stopped. Miss Dashwood inclined her head in acknowledgement, disengaged one hand gently from the boy's grip. He retained the other with the tenacity of the very young and the very certain, and prepared to take her leave. She was at the door when the Duke spoke again. "Miss Dashwood." She paused, turned fractionally. "You will begin on Thursday." It was not a question. It was, however, notably less than a command, the sort of sentence that leaves a door, just barely, ajar. "Thursday," she agreed and left. Behind her, in the high-ceilinged study with its two perfect furnishings and its three horrified council members, Arthur Sterling, Duke of Northcliffe, remained standing where she had left him. He was not, he told himself, thinking about the way his son had crossed a room full of powerful men to reach her without hesitation. He was not thinking about it at all. He sat down at his desk, drew the nearest document toward him, and read the same line 4 times without retaining a single word. Chapter 2, Cracks in the Stone. The estate did not change all at once. That was, perhaps, what made it so difficult to address. Had Miss Dashwood arrived and immediately rearranged the furniture, dismissed the existing routines, and imposed her preferences upon Northcliffe Park with the blunt efficiency of a general occupying new territory, the Duke would have known precisely what to do. He would have summoned her, reminded her of the limits of her appointment, and restored order with the same cold dispatch he applied to every administrative irregularity that had the poor judgment to present itself to him. He was very good at restoring order. He had been doing it since he was 19 years old, and the dukedom had landed on him all at once, like weather. But Miss Dashwood did not rearrange. She adjusted. Quietly, incrementally, in ways that revealed themselves only in retrospect, so that by the end of the first week, Arthur Sterling found himself standing in doorways he did not usually occupy, looking at rooms that were somehow different from what they had been, and being unable to identify the precise moment the difference had arrived. Cashin's rooms had been the first. She had said nothing further about the wall, having made her opinion clear at the outset, but had simply, over the course of 2 days, shifted the arrangement of the space by increments. The narrow bed now faced the window. The writing table had been moved toward the light. A shelf that had contained decorative objects of no interest to a 5-year-old boy had been cleared and restocked with things that were a smooth river stone, a jar of dried seed pods, a wooden horse with a repaired leg, a book of illustrated natural history with illustrations large enough to invite investigation. The room was not disordered. It was inhabited. There was a distinction, and it unsettled him in ways he could not entirely justify. She had also, without apparent self-consciousness, begun greeting the senior staff by name. Not the senior staff as a category, their names, specifically, learned within the first 3 days and deployed with the casual ease of a woman who considered the names of the people around her to be elementary information rather than optional detail. He had observed Mrs. Fenwick, his housekeeper of 14 years, receive this treatment and react with an expression that he could only classify as gratified, which was an expression he had not previously witnessed on Mrs. Fenwick's face in any context. He told himself he was watching from oversight. It was entirely reasonable for the master of an estate to observe the conduct of newly appointed staff, particularly staff whose terms of engagement had been unconventional. He told himself this on Monday, when he watched from the upper corridor as she led Cashin through the kitchen garden with the measured patience of a woman conducting a lesson disguised as a walk. He told himself this on Wednesday, when he stood at the library window long enough to observe her correct a footman's arrangement of the morning room chairs and do so with sufficient tact that the footman appeared to consider the correction a collaborative achievement. He told himself this on Friday, when she looked up from the garden directly at the window where he stood. She did not look away. She raised one eyebrow, not archly, not with challenge precisely, but with the particular economy of a person communicating, in a single movement of one facial feature, that they are aware of a thing and have decided to acknowledge it without making a scene of the acknowledgement. Then she returned her attention to his son, who was attempting to identify a beetle. The Duke stepped back from the window. He was not certain, afterward, whether he had stepped back or retreated. The distinction mattered to him in a way he found irritating. He had looked away first. He could not recall, searching back across 31 years with the thoroughness of a man who keeps careful internal records, a single instance in which he had looked away first. From anyone. He found the sensation deeply, specifically annoying. He returned to his correspondence with the focused efficiency of a man who has decided that a minor irregularity does not merit further consideration, and spent the next 20 minutes reading the same letter from his solicitor without retaining its contents, which was an irregularity he declined to examine too closely. Dinner on the Thursday of the second week was Cashin's doing, in the way that most disruptions of late could be traced, with minimal investigation, back to Cashin. The boy had asked, with the devastating simplicity of a child who does not yet understand that requests can be declined by people he has decided to trust, whether Miss Dashwood might dine with them. Not with the staff. With them. He had made this request to his father directly, standing in the study doorway with his chin at the determined angle that Arthur had begun to recognize as the angle that meant the matter was, in Cashin's estimation, already settled. The Duke had looked at his son for a long moment. He had then looked past his son at the empty hallway and thought, briefly, of Miss Dashwood's raised eyebrow. If she is willing, he had said, and returned to his papers before his face could do anything further without his permission. She was willing. She arrived at the table without ceremony, sat where directed, and engaged Cashin immediately in a conversation about the beetle from the garden, which had apparently been named, housed in a jar with appropriate ventilation holes, and given a provisional biography that she listened to with every appearance of sincere interest. The Duke sat at the head of the table and said nothing, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he was finding it difficult to look anywhere other than slightly left of where he was looking. She ate with appetite. She passed bread to Cashin before the footman could do it, which caused the footman a moment of confusion and her no apparent concern. When Cashin said something that amused her, she laughed, not the careful, contained sound that women in dining rooms were understood to produce, but an actual laugh, warm and unguarded, the laugh of a person who finds something genuinely funny and sees no reason to diminish the fact. It was too loud for a formal dining room. It was also, he noted, despite himself, entirely without artifice. He watched her draw Cashin out with the ease of long practice, asking questions that required more than a single word in response, listening to the answers as though they contained information she had been hoping to receive, redirecting the conversation when the boy's enthusiasm outpaced his narrative coherence, which was frequently. Cashin bloomed under this treatment in the visible way of a plant that has been moved into better light. Arthur observed it and felt something he did not immediately identify, a warmth at the edges of what was ordinarily a quite manageable situation. Then Cashin turned to him and asked for a story. The table went, internally if not externally, still. Miss Dashwood continued to arrange the remaining bread on her plate. She did not look at him. She did not look deliberately away from him, which would have been worse. She simply continued what she was doing, with the manner of a woman who expects that the situation will resolve itself without her intervention. Arthur Sterling told stories to no one. He had not, to his recollection, told a story to anyone since he was himself a child, when the telling had been managed by people whose employment made it their function. He knew this about himself without particular feeling, in the way one knows other fixed facts about one's circumstances. He told a story. It was not a good story. It began with a knight who had a horse and proceeded through a series of events that had not been planned in advance and therefore accumulated a number of narrative inconsistencies, including a dragon that appeared in the third sentence and was then forgotten until he remembered it near the end and resolved it hastily. Cashin sat with his elbows on the table, which ought to have been corrected, and listened with his whole body in the manner of a child entirely absorbed. He asked 3 questions, all of which required improvisation. Arthur improvised. The story ended. Cashin announced that it was the best story he had ever heard, which was the extravagant and sincere verdict of a child who is not yet embarrassed by enthusiasm, and demanded to know what the knight's horse was named. Arthur had not given the horse a name. Aldenmere, he said, which was the first word that arrived. Cashin considered this. Like the river, he said. Like the river. He looked up then because the room had done something or seemed to. Miss Dashwood was looking at him across the table. She was not smiling in the way people smile when they are being polite, or in the way they smile when they are being careful. She was smiling in the way a person smiles when they have seen something that they find unexpectedly, specifically good. A smile that arrived without performance and settled on her face with the ease of something that belonged there. It arrived somewhere in him that he had not expected to be reached. He looked at his wineglass. He took a measured sip. He said, in the general direction of his son, that it was past the hour for dinner to conclude, and the evening proceeded along proper lines from that point forward. He was grateful for proper lines. He had, this evening, found them more useful than usual. He summoned her to the study the following morning. She arrived punctually on this occasion, which he suspected was deliberate, a silent acknowledgment that punctuality, like tardiness, could be a choice rather than a failure. She sat across the desk with her hands folded and the composed expression of a woman who is prepared to listen without having decided in advance to agree. He said, with the measured authority of a man re-establishing the terms of a situation that had not required re-establishing until recently, "I wish to speak with you regarding the scope of your appointment." "Of course, Your Grace. Your position is that of caretaker to my son. It is not that of household consultant, nor of dining companion, nor—" He paused, and chose his next words with the care of a man selecting the right instrument for a delicate task, "of informal authority over arrangements that fall outside the nursery." She listened to this in its entirety without interruption, which he had half expected her to provide. She had the manner of a woman who interrupted only when she had something more precise to say than what was currently being said, and she was waiting, he understood, to see whether he would arrive at anything that qualified. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Has Cashin been well this past week, Your Grace?" He looked at her. The question was simple. It was not a challenge, not technically. It was a question about his son's welfare, which was, by any measure, the stated purpose of her appointment. It was also, precisely and without elaboration, the one question he could not answer in a way that served the argument he had been making. Cashin had been well. Cashin had been, observably and specifically, better than well, more settled, more cheerful, sleeping through the night for the first time in several months, eating without the coaxing that mealtimes had previously required, spending his days with the purposeful energy of a child whose hours contained things worth doing. Arthur knew this because he had noticed it, and he had noticed it because he had been paying attention, and he had been paying attention because he did not complete that particular line of thought. He said nothing. She rose, inclined her head, and moved toward the door. He did not dismiss her. The protocol of such a meeting required that the superior conclude it, a small but legible signal of where authority resided. He had not concluded it. She reached the door without him having done so, and she paused there for precisely the length of time that demonstrated she had noticed, then opened it and left. He became aware, in the silence she left behind, that he was watching the doorway. He became aware, specifically, that he had been watching the line of her shoulders as she crossed the room, the way she carried herself, straight without stiffness, with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her own spine, and that he had continued watching after the door closed, which was information he found inconvenient in the extreme. He redirected his attention to his desk with the focused deliberateness of a man who has identified a problem and intends to manage it before it manages him. He was not entirely certain he was winning. He had not intended to be in the nursery corridor at that hour. He had been returning from the East Wing, a review of the accounts ledger that had run later than anticipated, and the nursery corridor was not, strictly speaking, on the most direct route to his own chambers. He had taken it regardless, which he attributed to habit, though he was aware that habit was doing considerable work as an explanation. The door was ajar. The lamp within cast the particular quality of light that belongs to late evenings in warm rooms, amber and low and without the hardness of daylight or the formality of candlelit entertaining. He heard, first, Cashin's voice in protest, and then his own name in his son's phrasing, "Papa is trying," and then nothing, and the nothing made him push the door open by another inch. He was sitting on the low chair by the bed, and he was losing. He had thought it would be a simple matter. He had observed it done, in the abstract way one observes tasks performed by staff without filing the details. It was hair. It was braiding. It was a thing done daily by women of every station without particular difficulty, and his son had requested it because Miss Dashwood had braided it twice this week, and Cashin had apparently decided that this was now how evenings concluded. Arthur had sent word that Miss Dashwood was not required this evening, and then found himself in this chair with a comb and the growing awareness that the task was more architecturally complex than it had appeared from a distance. Cashin bore this with the long-suffering patience of a child who loves a parent and has therefore decided to tolerate their limitations. He heard the soft sound of the door opening further. He did not turn. She crossed the room without speaking. She did not comment on the state of the braid, which was generous. She did not ask permission, which he noted, and found that he did not object to, which he also noted. She simply drew a low stool beside the chair, settled on it, and reached up, not to take over, but to place her hands lightly over his and reposition them by degrees, her fingers adjusting the angle of his grip, guiding the sections into correct relation with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned that showing is faster than explaining. Their fingers overlapped. Neither moved to correct it. He was aware of her hands over his with a clarity that had nothing to do with the task and everything to do with the fact that he could not recall the last time anyone had touched his hands in a manner that was not a formal greeting. He was aware of her proximity, the warmth of another person at close range, the slight sound of her breathing, the fact that if he turned his head by any meaningful degree, he would be looking at her face from a distance that was not appropriate to their respective positions. He did not turn his head. He continued the braid, guided by her adjustments, until it was done and tied off, and Cashin declared it acceptable in the magnanimous tone of a child issuing a pardon. He fell asleep quickly, as children do when the evening has concluded satisfactorily. They remained. He was not certain why. There was no administrative reason for it. The task was complete. The child was asleep, the lamp could be turned down, and the evening concluded by either of them at any point. Neither of them concluded it. They sat in the lamplight with the low quiet of the room around them, shoulders near enough that the distance was a decision rather than an accident, and the silence between them was nothing like the silence he knew. The silence he knew was the silence of empty rooms and concluded business, and the particular absence of sound that accumulates in a house when its inhabitants have stopped expecting it to contain warmth. This silence was inhabited. It was shared. It had a quality he did not have a word for, and the absence of the word bothered him considerably less than it ought. He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. It was not the eyebrow, not the assessment, not any of the looks she had given him in daylight hours when there were distances and desks and the architecture of authority between them. It was a look without any of that, direct and unguarded and carrying, in the amber light, something that he could neither name nor dismiss. Her face was entirely still. He looked away. A moment later she did the same. Neither spoke. She rose quietly from the stool, turned the lamp to its lowest setting, and moved to the door. He remained in the chair and listened to her footsteps recede down the corridor, and sat in the dark room next to his sleeping son, and looked at the ceiling. He was a man of considerable resources. He had managed estates, negotiated treaties, overseen the education of hundreds of tenants' children, and conducted himself with distinction through 17 years of adult responsibility. He had managed every irregular thing that had presented itself to him with the cool efficiency that his position required. He stayed in the chair for a very long time. He had no explanation for what had just happened that he found satisfactory. He tried several. He discarded all of them. Outside the window, Northcliffe Park lay still and dark and entirely as it had always been. Inside the nursery, something had shifted in a direction he could not reverse, and he was not, he discovered, certain that he wished to. That, more than anything else, concerned him. Chapter 3. What Grief Looks Like on a Duke. She found the portrait by accident, as one finds most things that subsequently refuse to leave the mind. It was the third week of her appointment, on an afternoon when Cashin had been surrendered to his lessons with the tutor and she had been given, per the terms she had negotiated, the hours between 2 and 4 o'clock as her own. She had intended to walk. The sky had intended otherwise, producing the particular gray drizzle of an English afternoon that has decided to be disagreeable without committing fully to a storm, and she had retreated instead to the long gallery on the first floor, which she had not yet had occasion to explore. The gallery was cold and formal and very long, lined on both sides with the accumulated portraiture of several centuries of sterling consequence. She walked it slowly, as one walks such spaces, with the mild, detached interest of a visitor who is not personally implicated in the history on display. Earls and their countesses. A general in full dress. A woman in Restoration fashion who shared the current duke's jaw and appeared equally disinclined to be trifled with. 3 consecutive portraits of men who had clearly considered their hunting dogs a more interesting subject than themselves. She had almost reached the far end when she saw it. It was not the largest portrait in the gallery, nor the most prominently placed. It hung in the last bay before the turn, where the afternoon light, on days when there was any, would have reached it last. A woman, younger than Mabel had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected, with dark hair dressed simply and an expression that was neither the performed serenity of formal portraiture nor its performed authority. She looked, Mabel thought, like a person who had agreed to sit for a portrait and had not entirely agreed to be other than herself while doing so. There was warmth in the painted face, and something that might have been amusement, and the quality of a person who is comfortable in her own presence. Beside the frame, on a small brass plate, Eleanor Vane Sterling, Duchess of Northcliffe. 1788 to 1819. 31 years. The same age as the Duke. Mabel stood before the portrait for a long time. She had gathered the facts of it gradually, in the way one gathers things in a household where the subject is not spoken of directly but is present in every careful omission. Mrs. Fenwick had supplied the outline, obliquely, over the course of several conversations in which the housekeeper had not technically said anything specific and had communicated everything essential. The late Duchess had been traveling to visit her family in the north. It had been November, the roads not yet closed but not reliable, and the Duke had been in London for a parliamentary summit of some significance, the kind of significance that had seemed, at the time, to justify the decision to send his wife ahead without him and join her the following week. He had never joined her. The carriage had gone off the road in the dark, on a section of track that ran alongside a considerable drop, and Eleanor Sterling had not survived it. Cashin had been 2 years old. The Duke had arrived 3 days later to a house that had already done its weeping, and had not, as far as anyone at Northcliffe could recall, done his. The coldness, Mabel had come to understand, was not temperament. It was architecture, built deliberately, stone by stone, over the years since, to cover something that had not been managed and could not be managed and therefore had to be walled in with enough competence and control and impenetrable ducal authority to prevent it from doing damage. She understood this because she recognized the structure. She had seen it built before, in smaller versions, by people with fewer resources and less to lose, and the material was always the same: guilt, specifically the guilt of someone who was not in the place they should have been when the thing that could not be undone occurred. She looked at the portrait for a long time. She thought about the clumsy story at dinner, and the name given to the horse without hesitation. She thought about the nursery corridor, and the lamplight, and the silence that had been nothing like any silence she had sat in before. She thought about a man who had spent 3 years building walls and had not, she suspected, considered the possibility that a wall kept things in as effectively as it kept them out. Her feelings toward him had been, until this moment, a thing she had managed with moderate success: warmth kept at a careful distance, interest noted and set aside, the specific awareness of another person held at the length that propriety and good sense jointly recommended. She was not given to self-deception, and she had known, with the quiet clarity of a woman who pays attention to her own interior weather, that the distance had been narrowing. But it had been, until now, a distance she could theoretically maintain. She looked at Eleanor Sterling's painted face, and at the date on the brass plate, and felt the remaining distance close without her permission. She was falling. She knew it with the certainty of someone who has felt the moment of losing footing and understands, before the fall is complete, that they are not going to recover their balance. She was not alarmed by it, precisely. She was something more complicated than alarmed, aware of the danger, aware of the depth, standing at the edge with full knowledge of what lay below and the dawning, inconvenient understanding that she was going to step off regardless. She turned from the portrait, walked back along the gallery through the accumulated centuries of sterling consequence, and said nothing to anyone. The storm arrived on a Friday, properly and without apology. It had been threatening since midday, the sky doing the gradual, deliberate work of a storm that intends to be significant, and by 10 o'clock it had achieved its ambitions entirely, delivering rain against the windows with the sustained force of something that had no intention of concluding before it had made its point. The house had settled into the particular quiet of a large building at night in bad weather. All the ordinary sounds muffled, the staff long retired, the corridors empty and lamplit and resonant with the kind of stillness that makes a person more aware than usual of being awake. Mabel had not been able to sleep. She had tried, with the disciplined application of a woman who considers unnecessary wakefulness an inefficiency, and had failed, which she attributed to the storm and not to anything else. She had dressed again and come downstairs with the intention of finding something in the library that would serve the purpose that sleep was declining to, and had opened the library door to find it already occupied. The Duke was at the far window, not reading, not working, simply standing with a glass in his hand and his back partly to the room, looking at the storm. He turned when she entered. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the pause of two people establishing, without words, whether the intrusion was welcome or merely acknowledged. He said, "Miss Dashwood." She said, "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was not aware the room was in use." She had already begun to withdraw when he said, with the particular absence of inflection that she had come to understand was his manner of making a concession without appearing to make one, "You need not go." She did not go. She selected a chair near the fire, at a reasonable distance from the window where he stood, and opened the book she had brought without particular attention to its contents. He remained at the window. The storm continued its argument with the glass. It was some time before either spoke again. "You have been in the long gallery," he said. It was not quite a question. She looked up. "Mrs. Fenwick mentioned it?" "No one mentioned it." The pause. "There is only one reason a person stands in front of that particular portrait for the length of time you were there." She considered her response with the care the moment required. "She was very young," she said at last. "Yes." The storm threw rain against the window in a fresh gust. He turned from it and moved to the chair across from her. Not the chair at his desk, not the chair of administrative authority, but the one by the opposite side of the fire, close enough that the conversation could continue without requiring either of them to raise their voice. "I was in London," he said. "There was a matter before Parliament." She did not. He stopped. "Revised. I chose to remain. I sent her ahead." He said it the way a man reads a charge from a document. Without inflection, without the bid for sympathy that would have made it easier to receive, without the contextualizing that people invariably attempt when confessing the thing they most hold against themselves. He simply said it, as though it were a fact of the same order as the date on the brass plate, and waited with the stillness of a man who has held this particular weight for long enough that he has forgotten what it felt like without it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I lost my mother when I was 17. Fever. She was ill for 4 days and I was visiting my aunt in Bath, and by the time the letter reached me she was already—" She did not finish the sentence. "I was 17 years old and I was in Bath because I had wanted to go, and she had let me, and I have never entirely finished arguing with myself about it." He looked at her. "The arguing does not resolve," she said, "because there is nothing to resolve. The thing happened. The choice was made in ignorance of what the choice would cost, as all choices are made. You were not in that carriage because you were doing the work your position required of you. She was on that road because roads exist and carriages travel them, and November does what November does without consulting anyone's circumstances." She looked at the fire. "It is not a debt, Your Grace. It does not have a balance. It is only grief, and grief is not a ledger." He did not speak for a long time. When she looked up he was watching her with the expression she had seen only once before, in the nursery, in the lamplight, the expression that was unguarded in the specific way of a person who has been reached somewhere they had not expected to be reachable. He looked, she thought, not like a duke and not like a man who had spent 3 years being powerful enough to keep everything at a distance. He looked like a person sitting with something very heavy who had just been told, for the first time, that he might be permitted to set it down. She was not prepared for what happened next, and she did not think he was either. He reached across the space between them and, with the careful, almost wondering deliberateness of a man doing something entirely without precedent in his own experience, he tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face. His fingers barely grazed her temple. He froze at what he had done. She went very still. Neither of them spoke. The fire shifted and settled. The storm continued, entirely indifferent to the two people sitting in the lamplight on either side of it, not moving, not speaking, not looking away, in a silence that had become, without either of them marking the precise moment of the change, something neither of them knew how to conclude. Cashin's fever arrived in the small hours of Sunday morning. It came the way fevers come in children, swiftly, decisively, without the preliminary warnings that might have permitted preparation, and it was Mrs. Fenwick's knock at Mabel's door at 2:30 that woke her, the housekeeper's face in the lamplight carrying the particular controlled anxiety of a woman of long experience who is worried and has decided that being worried is not, at present, useful. Mabel was in the nursery within 4 minutes, and the Duke was already there. He was standing at the bedside in his shirt-sleeves, no coat, no cravat, the informal dress of a man who had come without stopping for the armor of his ordinary appearance, and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, young. Not young in the way of inexperience, but young in the way of fear unmanaged, the particular youthful quality that returns to a face when the thing being feared is the loss of something irreplaceable. He looked at her when she entered with an expression that asked a question he did not have the words for. She went directly to the bed, laid her hand on Cassion's forehead, assessed, and said, with a steadiness she produced deliberately, "It is a fever. Children run fevers. We will watch it through the night and it will break before morning." She said this with the authority of a woman who had managed 3 younger siblings through childhood illness, and not with the certainty she did not yet possess, and she said it because it was what the room required and because the Duke was watching his son with the eyes of a man who had already lost one person he could not afford to lose. They kept the vigil together. The night arranged itself into the particular suspended rhythm of illness watching, the regular checks of temperature, the cool cloth, the coaxing of small sips of water, the long stretches of quiet between the necessary actions where there was nothing to do but be present and wait. They sat on opposite sides of the narrow bed and spoke in whispers, because the illness demanded quiet even when the boy was fitfully asleep, and the whispers produced a register of conversation that the ordinary distances of their days had not accommodated. He asked, in the way of a man who needs the distraction of ordinary speech to keep the fear from becoming unmanageable, "You have managed illness before." "4 times with my younger brother alone," she said. "He had a particular talent for it. And he recovered. Every time." Much to his own subsequent disappointment, he had discovered that being ill was the only circumstance under which Cook would produce syllabub on demand. A breath of something, in the darkness across the bed. Not quite a laugh. The beginning of one, perhaps, the shape of it before he caught it. They talked. Not continuously, there were long silences that neither rushed to fill, but through the night, in fragments, in the way people speak when they are tired and the hour has stripped away the performances that daylight requires. He spoke about Cassion with the unguarded particularity of a father who does not often have occasion to speak of his son to someone who already knows and likes him. She spoke about her family with the fond exasperation of a woman who loves people who are, in her estimation, frequently unreasonable. Neither spoke of the library, or the storm, or the strand of hair. They did not need to. By 5 o'clock the fever had begun to ease. By 6 the boy's skin had cooled to something reasonable, and his breathing had steadied into the deep, untroubled rhythm of a child genuinely, rather than fitfully, asleep. The gray beginning of dawn was at the window. They were both, she realized, exhausted in the loose, almost peaceable way that follows sustained vigilance, the particular relief of a body that has been braced for a long time and has been permitted, at last, to unbrace. The Duke looked across the sleeping child at her. "Mabel," he said. Not Miss Dashwood. Her name, her given name, the first time he had used it, spoken quietly and without preamble, as though it had arrived in his mouth without being sent for. As though it were simply the word that belonged to the moment. She looked up. The lamplight was thin in the growing dawn, and the room was very quiet, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no defense against. Not the unguarded look of the nursery or the library, but something beyond those, something that had passed through every careful layer of him and arrived without any of his ordinary management. He leaned slightly forward, across the narrow space above the sleeping boy, and she did not move back, and the distance between them became something that was no longer distance at all but a threshold, and they were both of them on the edge of it. The knock came from the corridor. A servant's knock, practical and uninflected, bearing word that the physician had arrived from the village and was waiting below. He straightened. She sat back. The threshold closed. She watched him reassemble himself, not with resentment, not with relief, but with the particular awareness of a woman who has just felt the loss of a moment and knows, with complete clarity, that it was a loss and not a reprieve. His face found its ordinary composure. He rose to receive the physician. She remained at the bedside with her hands folded and felt the absence of the interrupted moment like a presence in the room. The physician declared Cassion well and left before 8 o'clock. The morning proceeded with the careful normalcy of a household restoring itself after a disruption. Breakfast arranged, staff resumed, the day's ordinary business reclaiming its shape around the night's extraordinary one. Cassion slept on, which the physician had recommended and Mabel had enforced against 2 separate attempts by the boy to declare himself sufficiently recovered for the garden. The Duke had attended to the first matter of correspondence that could not be deferred and had then, as the house settled, appeared in the corridor outside the nursery with the manner of a man who has arrived somewhere without being entirely certain of his route. He said he would walk her to her rooms, as it was long past the hour at which she ought to have slept. She did not argue. She was tired in the deep bone-level way of a night without rest, and she had, in any case, no argument to make. They walked the corridor in silence, not the silence of estrangement, not the professional quiet of employer and employee navigating shared space, but the easy, worn silence of two people who have spent a night beside each other in difficult circumstances and have, without formal agreement, arrived somewhere beyond the requirement for speech. Their footsteps were quiet on the carpeted floor. The house was waking around them in the unhurried way of early morning. At her door she stopped and turned, with the intention of bidding him good morning and concluding the night with the proper formality that the day required. He was closer than she had measured. Not improperly so, not in any way that could be described, to any observer, as other than a man who had simply not stepped back at the moment he might have. But close enough that she was aware of it with a precision that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the fact that she had been aware of him, in this specific and inconvenient way, for longer than she had found it comfortable to acknowledge. His hand came up and rested against the doorframe beside her head. Not enclosing. Not demanding. Simply as though he had reached for the wood the way a person reaches for something solid when the ground beneath them has become less than reliable. He looked at her. The early morning light was thin and gray at the corridor window, and it fell across his face with the impartiality of daylight, and she could see him plainly, the exhaustion of the night, and beneath it, clearly now, the thing he had been managing and was, at this particular moment, not entirely managing. He looked at her like a question that had been assembled slowly, over weeks, out of stolen glances and lamplight and a silence that had felt like sharing. She looked back. She looked back like a woman who knows the answer and is not yet certain she is ready for what the answer costs. She was not afraid of him. She had not been afraid of him since the riverbank, if she had ever been. She was afraid of something less containable than a duke, the specific vertigo of a thing that cannot be unmade, the knowledge that a door, once opened, changes the room on both sides of it permanently. She looked at him and felt all of this and did not move away. He lowered his head. Slowly, with the deliberateness of a man not acting on impulse but on a decision that had been arriving for some time and had finally, in the gray morning outside her door, completed its journey. "Your Grace." The voice came from the far end of the corridor. His steward, with the expression of a man who is genuinely apologetic and genuinely unable to wait. Urgent news from the Eastern Tenancy. A matter that could not, the steward's face communicated with helpless precision, be deferred. The Duke straightened. His hand left the doorframe. He stepped back with the controlled composure of a man who has had considerable practice in the management of his own face, and when he looked at her his expression had resumed its familiar structure, not cold, not distant, but correct. Composed. The Duke once more. "Good morning, Miss Dashwood," he said. "Rest." He walked away down the corridor. She opened her door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. She stood with her back against the wood and her eyes closed, her heart conducting itself in a manner entirely out of proportion to the circumstances, and remained there until she could be certain that her face, should she happen to pass a mirror, would tell no one anything. Outside in the corridor, his footsteps receded. Next time, she thought, and did not finish the thought because she did not need to. It was already finished. It had been finished, she suspected, from the moment a small boy had crossed a room full of powerful men and taken her hand without hesitation, and a duke had watched him do it and said nothing at all. Next time, nothing would interrupt it. Chapter 4. The Girl He Couldn't Lose. She wrote the letter on a Tuesday morning, in the small neat hand she had been taught by a governess who believed that penmanship was the outward evidence of an ordered mind. Her mind was not, at present, particularly ordered, but her hand was steady, which would have to suffice. She had been composing the letter in some form or another since the morning outside her door, since she had stood with her back against the wood and her heart in a condition she could not permit to continue, and understood with the clarity that arrives, uninvited, in the moments after almost, that she had gone considerably further than she had intended to go and could not find her way back to the distance that safety required. She had managed 3 more days. She had been scrupulously correct in those 3 days, professional in her conduct, measured in her speech, present for Cashin with the full warmth the boy deserved and absent from every situation that might produce another corridor, another doorframe, another lamplight silence that she did not have the defenses to survive. It had not helped. It had, if anything, clarified the problem with a specificity she found deeply inconvenient. The problem was not that she was falling. She had accepted that on the afternoon she stood before Eleanor Sterling's portrait and felt the last of her managed distance dissolve. The problem was that she had, without intending to, arrived at a place from which the only exits were 2 in number and neither of them comfortable. She could remain and love a man who had not offered her anything she could hold and who existed in a world that would not, without significant consequences, accommodate what she felt. Or she could leave, while leaving was still a choice she was making rather than a wound she was escaping. She chose to leave. She told herself it was the sensible decision, and it was, and the fact that it felt nothing like sense was information she declined to act upon. Your Grace, the letter began, in the formal register that the situation required, it is with sincere gratitude for the confidence you have placed in me that I tender my resignation from the position of caretaker to your son, to take effect at the end of the present week. Master Sterling is a child of exceptional character, and it has been the privilege of my recent weeks to have contributed, however modestly, to his care. She paused at privilege. It was the right word. It was also, in the full weight of what she was resigning, an understatement so considerable as to be almost dishonest. She left it. Honesty had its limits, and this letter was not the place to exceed them. She sealed the letter, set it on the writing table, and turned to the business of packing. She told Cashin at 11 o'clock in the garden, where the morning was clear and the light was generous, and she had selected the location with the awareness that a child who might cry would find the open air more manageable than an enclosed room. She crouched to his level and told him simply that she had very much enjoyed her time at Northcliffe, that she thought him an extraordinary boy, that this was not because anything was wrong but because circumstances required it, and that she fully expected him to continue the Beatles biography without her and to report any significant developments by letter. Cashin listened to all of this without interrupting, which was unusual. When she finished he was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a child processing information, but the quiet of a child who has already processed it and arrived at a conclusion and is considering his next action. She recognized the quality of it. She had seen it before, on the day he had walked across the study and taken her hand in front of the council. He said, "I see." Then he went inside. She remained in the garden for a moment, watching him go, and permitted herself the understanding that he was not going to his tutor or to the kitchens or to any of the ordinary destinations of a boy's morning. She permitted herself this understanding and then folded it away with everything else and went upstairs to finish packing. She was folding the last of her things, the spare muslin, the good shawl, the small volume of essays she had brought from home and never opened, when she heard the footsteps in the corridor. Not a servant's measured pace. Not the housekeeper's brisk, purposeful tread. Not the light, quick sound of a small boy running. These were long strides, taken fast, carrying the weight of someone covering ground without the ordinary regard for the acoustics of a carpeted corridor, the footsteps of a man for whom, at this particular moment, the appearance of composure was not the primary concern. Her hands stilled over the bag. She did not move. The footsteps reached her door and stopped, and in the silence that followed she could hear, beneath the ordinary sounds of the house and the garden and the Tuesday morning going about its business outside the window, the sound of her own heart conducting itself in the unreasonable manner it had adopted and that she had been, until this moment, almost successfully managing. 3 seconds. Then the knock. It was not the knock of the Duke of Northcliffe. That knock, the one she had heard on the rare occasions when authority was being communicated through the medium of a closed door, had a particular quality. Measured, deliberate, the knock of a man who knocks because the door has indicated that knocking is the procedure, not because he requires admittance. It was the knock of a person for whom the answer is not genuinely in question. This knock was uncertain. She crossed to the door and opened it. He was in his riding coat, which meant he had been outside when Cashin found him, and he had come directly here without stopping for anything. No gloves, no hat, nothing that would have required the additional 60 seconds of preparation that a man of his position habitually and automatically applied before presenting himself anywhere. His hair was slightly disordered from the wind. He looked, standing in her doorway without any of the architecture of his ordinary authority, like a man who had run out of ways to manage the thing he was carrying and had arrived here because there was nowhere else to go. He looked, she thought, exactly like a person. "Cashin told me," he said. "Not your grace, not preamble, not the formal opening that every exchange between them had been framed by until this moment. Just those 3 words, in the voice of a man who had started somewhere in the middle of a conversation that had been going on inside him for considerably longer than this morning. "I had intended to send the letter," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "I would prefer that you did not." She waited. He was not, she understood, a man for whom this came easily. Not the asking. He did not ask, as a rule, having found over the years that a duke does not need to, and not this specific variety of standing in a doorway with nothing between himself and the answer except whatever she decided to do with the next several minutes. She could see the effort of it, not as weakness but as cost, the deliberate setting aside of every protective habit that 3 years of careful, systematic self-containment had produced. He said, "When Cashin came to find me, he said that you were leaving and that I was to do something about it." The pause. Something moved across his face, not quite the beginning of a smile, but the place one starts from. He said it with a degree of authority that I found, under the circumstances, difficult to dispute. "He is your son," she said. "He is." He looked at her steadily. "He is also right." He stepped forward, not into the room, still in the doorway, still maintaining what could technically be described as a respectful distance, but closer, and with the full attention of a man who has decided that the words he is about to say are the truest he has spoken in a very long time. "I have been powerful," he said, "for a great many years. I have been capable and I have been responsible and I have managed everything within the reach of my management and I have done it, I believe, adequately. And it has not, for a single day of those years, felt like enough." He stopped. Continued. "Since November of 1819 I have lived in this house and conducted the business of this estate and raised my son to the best of my ability, and I have told myself, repeatedly, that adequacy was what remained available to me, and that a man who made the choices I made had no reasonable claim to anything further." She was very still. "And then a woman jumped into the river Aldenmere," he said, "and declined my money and lectured me about river safety and rearranged my son's bedroom and yawned when I attempted to intimidate her, and I find that He stopped again. This stop was different from the others. Not the stop of a man choosing his words, but the stop of a man who has arrived, unexpectedly, at the edge of something true and is deciding whether to step off it. "I find that I do not want to be adequate. I want to be worthy of my son, of this house, of the life that is still here, that I have been, that I have not permitted myself to." He did not finish the sentence. He looked at her with the open, undefended face of a man who has put down everything he has been carrying and is standing, for the first time in years, without the weight of it, and who is not yet certain what that means or what comes next, and who is, despite the uncertainty, not sorry. "Of you," he said quietly. "I want to be worthy of you, Mabel." The room was very quiet. Outside the window the Tuesday morning continued its business, birds and wind, and the distant sound of the estate going about its day, and none of it had any relevance to the 2 people standing on either side of a doorway in which something had just, irrevocably and completely, changed. She looked at him for a long moment. Not because she was uncertain. She had not, if she was entirely honest with herself, been uncertain since the night in the nursery when their fingers had overlapped and neither of them had pulled away, since the library and the storm and a strand of hair and a silence that had nothing cold in it. She had been frightened, which was a different thing entirely, and she had handled her fear in the manner she handled most things that frightened her, by attempting to walk away from it before it could cost her anything she could not afford to lose. She was done walking away. But there was one thing she needed him to hear first. "I will not be a quiet arrangement," she said. "I will not be a woman kept in a house and chosen in private and presented to no one because the choice is inconvenient or because the world will have opinions about it. I am a gentleman's daughter without fortune and without title, and I am entirely aware of what that means in the world we occupy." She looked at him without apology and without performance, with the direct, clear gaze she had offered him since the riverbank. "If you choose me, Your Grace, you choose me openly, fully, without the wall between us and without the management of it. I will not be loved like a secret." She had expected him to hesitate. She had expected the flicker of ducal calculus, the brief, reflexive assessment of consequence and propriety and the considerable opinion of the considerable world he moved through. She had prepared quietly for it. She was a fair woman and she would not have blamed him for it. He crossed the room. He took her face in both hands with the careful, absolute certainty of a man who has made a decision and made it entirely. His palms warm against her jaw, his eyes on hers for one clear, unhurried moment, and kissed her. Not gently. Not with the tentative propriety of a first kiss between people who are still, in some technical sense, negotiating. He kissed her like a man who has been holding something back for a very long time and has, at last, with full and conscious intention, chosen to stop. She felt the months of it, the riverbank and the lamplight and the door frames and the almost and the interrupted moments, all of it arriving at once, and she kissed him back with the matching honesty of a woman who has also been holding something and is enormously relieved to put it down. When they pulled apart, she was laughing. It arrived softly against his mouth, before she could organize her face into anything more composed, the laugh of a person surprised by joy, by the specific, uncomplicated relief of a thing finally being exactly what it ought to be. She felt him still for a moment at the sound of it, and then something in him released, and he rested his forehead against hers with the ease of a man arriving somewhere he had not known he was trying to reach. "Mabel," he said. Just her name. Her given name, in the voice he had first used in the gray dawn of Cassion's fever, but fuller now, settled, as though it had found the register that belonged to it. "I am staying," she said. His arms came around her, and he held her with the particular quality of a man who has been given something he did not believe he was permitted to want and is not yet entirely certain the giving is real and is holding on, quietly and without performance, in the way of someone who intends to believe it. She let him. Outside the window the morning continued. The estate was exactly as it had always been, the grounds immaculate, the stonework permanent, the long history of sterling consequence arranged in orderly succession from gate to gallery. Nothing about it had changed. Everything else had. Breakfast the following morning was Cassion's triumph, and he knew it. He had positioned himself at the table with the satisfied air of a small person whose considerable investment in a particular outcome has been vindicated, and he ate his toast with the unhurried pleasure of a child at peace with the world and its arrangements. He had said nothing directly, had asked no questions, demanded no explanations, offered no commentary on the events of the previous afternoon, but he had looked at each of them in turn when they entered the breakfast room, and the look had contained, in equal measure, the vindication of a sound judge of character and the serene confidence of a boy who had known all along how things would be. The window was open. The morning was mild, the kind of April morning that arrives as an apology for March, and the light came in at the particular angle that made the breakfast room the warmest and most agreeable room in the house at this hour. The bread had been passed before the footman could manage it. Mabel had passed it, to Cassion, without thinking, in the easy habit of 3 weeks of mornings, and the footman had adjusted with the slightly baffled grace of a man who has been at Northcliffe long enough to understand that adjusting is now the order of things. Cassion was talking. He was talking about the Beadle. The Beadle's biography had, it emerged, taken a significant turn, involving a journey to the kitchen garden and back and a near-fatal encounter with the undergardener's boot, and he was talking with the full narrative commitment of a child who has a good story and an audience he trusts with it. He looked at Mabel as he told it, and at his father, and back again, with the ease of a boy who has stopped feeling the gap between the two and finds the table, this morning, entirely satisfactory. The Duke set down his cup. "Your mother," he said, in the conversational register of a man who has found, unexpectedly, that the words have arrived without the weight he had always expected them to carry, had a very particular feeling about beetles. Cashin stopped. He looked at his father with the careful attention of a child who has been wanting something for a long time and is not yet certain it is being offered. She found them remarkable, the Duke continued. She kept a journal, natural history mostly. Insects, birds, the occasional indignant rabbit. She would have had a great deal to say about your beetles specifically. He said it with love. With grief, present and acknowledged and not hidden, there in his voice like a note in a chord, inseparable from the rest of it, not diminishing it. With the peace of a man who has understood, at last, that love and loss are not in opposition, that the grief is not a punishment and the love is not a debt, that Eleanor Sterling can live in a story about a beetle at a breakfast table in April and the living of it is not disloyalty but the only form of keeping that means anything at all. Cashin said, "Will you tell me more about her?" "Yes," said the Duke. "I will tell you everything I know." Mabel looked at him across the table, at this man who had been cold and was not cold, who had been walled in and had chosen, with full knowledge of the cost, to come out, who was sitting in the morning light telling his son about his mother's beetle journal with the open, unhurried face of a person who has decided that the time still left is worth something, and felt, with the full weight of it, who he was becoming, who he had always been beneath the architecture, who he had been waiting, she thought, for someone to see. He looked up, caught her watching. He smiled. Not the formal inclination, not the almost, not the controlled softening that had stood in for warmth in the weeks before. A real smile, rare and unhurried, the smile of a man who is, at this precise moment, entirely where he intends to be. It arrived slowly, the way things arrive when they are not performed, and it changed his face entirely, the way light changes a room, and she felt it in the same place she had felt his name spoken softly across a sleeping child and his forehead resting against hers. He reached across the table. He laced his fingers through hers, slowly, openly, in the full light of a Tuesday morning with 2 footmen present and Mrs. Fenwick in the doorway and his son watching with the bright, expectant attention of a child who has been hoping for exactly this and is very pleased to have been right about it. He did not look at the footmen. He did not look at the doorway. He looked at her with the expression of a man making a choice in public and finding the public nature of it, for once, entirely the point. Cashin cheered. It was a full, wholehearted, 5-year-old cheer, the kind that does not modulate for the acoustics of a formal breakfast room, and it bounced off the walls and the open window and startled, somewhere in the garden, a bird. Mabel laughed. The Duke of Northcliffe, cold, powerful, untouchable, the man before whom every lord and lady and nobleman of the county arranged themselves in careful deference, laughed. It was not a polished sound. It was not a sound that had been produced before in this breakfast room, or possibly in this house, with this particular quality, unguarded and warm and real, the laugh of a man who has remembered, after a very long absence, what it is to find something uncomplicated and wholly good. It filled the room the way the light filled it, without effort, and it was, Mabel thought, the most beautiful sound she had heard since the morning a small boy had crossed a room full of powerful men and changed everything. Outside, the estate continued as it always had. The grounds immaculate, the stonework permanent, the long gallery unchanged, Eleanor Sterling's portrait in its bay at the end of the hall where the light came last. Inside the breakfast room, the bread was being passed again, and a boy was telling his father about a beetle, and 2 people who had arrived at each other by the most improbable of routes, a frozen river and a declined coin purse and a child's certain grip and 100 small moments of lamplight and almost, sat with their fingers laced together in the morning sun and were, in every way that mattered, entirely new. Thanks for listening to the end. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. There's another one waiting for you on the screen. Click it, keep listening, and stay in this world a little longer. And if you haven't already, drop a like, share and subscribe. We're on the way to 2,000 subscribers. Be part of it.